2, 1. It's just preparing the live stream.
Okay, good afternoon, everybody. My name is Mary Watson. I'm Pro-Vice Chancellor for Education and Student Experience at the University of Hertfordshire, and I'm here this afternoon to introduce our guest speaker, Trey Venter. Trey, I know from working at the University of Northampton, so I'm really thrilled to see him here and talking to us today. Trey's a writer, a poet, an educator, and a political activist. Last year, he was Vice President for the Black and Minority Ethnic Student Body at the University of Northampton Students' Union. Trey's passions lie with Black history and race, particularly the experiences of Black people and those racialised as Black, and also to include people and communities of African and Caribbean heritage that identify as mixed race. At the moment, Trey is also an MA student doing his postgraduate qualification in race, education and decolonial thought with Leeds Beckett University. Through his political activism, he's been interviewed by The Guardian and the BBC, and additionally, he writes a blog on Medium. Also, he's written for the online higher education policy magazine Wonky. Closer to home in his local Northamptonshire, he's written for the Nen Enquirer, sometimes working as a journalist, and Happyhood. Almost every week, Trey writes for the University of Northampton's BA Criminology blog, which you can follow on Twitter. Trey's not a historian. He's a student very much like many of you listening today, amongst other things, and is someone that likes to read. Today, Trey's going to be giving us an overview of the Black history of Britain that will hopefully leave us with more questions and answers. And we'll be taking questions at the end, and I'll curate those for you. And I'm looking forward to seeing what Trey's presentation provokes today. So he'll be covering from the current Black Lives Matter protests now in the wake of George Floyd, Breonna Taylor and others murdered by the police, to the Windrush scandal and a Black presence in Britain and its history that goes all the way back to Roman times. So with no further ado, I'm going to hand over to Trey and I'll be back with you at the end of Trey's presentation. Thank you.
Thank you. Mia, can you make me, let me share my screen?
Yeah, sure. I've just made you a host. Hopefully that should allow you to share your screen.
Oh. Okay, can you see that?
Yep.
Okay. So yeah, thanks for that, Mari. So I basically titled this "The Black History You Don't Learn at School," and I gave a version of this talk when I was the Black and Minority Ethnic Sabbatical Officer at Northampton. So I'm going to start with the murder of George Floyd. So in June 2020, George Floyd, a Black American man, was killed by Minneapolis police officer Derek Chauvin, sparking the biggest anti-racist demonstration in human history across the world. We saw protests across the US and in Britain too, France, the Netherlands, Canada, and more. Even seemingly stereotypically white English places like the Forest of Dean had a protest. Higham Ferrers in Northamptonshire had a protest. The murder of George Floyd, you could say it hit a note. However, George Floyd wasn't the first Black person to be killed by the police in America, and Black Lives Matter didn't start with him. The concept of Black death at the hands of police goes back decades, but Black Lives Matter started in 2012 by 3 Black women, Alicia Garza, Opal Tometi, and Patrice Tullis, in the United States in response to the murder of Trayvon Martin by another police officer, George Zimmerman. From a CNN editorial research in 2020, George Zimmerman was a neighborhood watch captain in Sanford, Florida, and he called a 911 to report a suspicious person in the neighborhood. He's instructed not to get out of his SUV or approach the person. Zimmerman disregards the instructions. Moments later, neighbors report hearing gunfire. Zimmerman acknowledges that he shot Martin, claiming it was in self-defense. And this is just one example of the numerous Black people that have become victims of US police officers. George Floyd, Breonna Taylor, and other recent victims of police on a long list have also been killed, including Eric Garner and Sandra Bland. To be Black in America is to be seen as less than human, which is what allowed Derek Chauvin to kill George Floyd. Quite literally for kneeling on his neck for 8 minutes and 46 seconds. And in the words of Malcolm X, that's not a chip on my shoulder, that's your foot on my neck. However, racist attacks on Black people also happened in Britain. One of the most famous in 1993 when teenagers Stephen Lawrence was murdered by white racists on the streets of London. Anthony Walker also met the same fate in Liverpool 2005. Historically, they've been most attacks against Black people too. Before Stephen Lawrence, there were race riots in Brixton in 1981 in response to police harassment of Black people, very much so the children of the Windrush generation. There were riots in Lewisham in 1977, and before that, in 58, with race riots in Notting Hill and Nottingham. And before that, in 1919, there were race riots when Black colonial soldiers during the First World War came back to England to make new lives. One such man was Charles Woodson. He was a Bermudan sailor that fought and now wanted to live in England, as was his right, as Bermuda was also a member of the Commonwealth and was a British colony. He was lynched at Albert Dock in Liverpool in June 1919. This was the year 1919, the year after the war where Black colonial soldiers were excluded from the victory parades. Like 2020, the year 1919 was a year of change, instability, and uncertainty. Race riots broke out across Britain, including Liverpool and Cardiff, and this legacy of rebellion in response to racism we are still living with today. And in the buzzword term of today, institutional racism, the fact Black people are still killed today, with nobody being persecuted for their murders. The fact Black lives still do not matter in both this country and the United States. Black death at the hands of authority bodies, not just police, is a tale as old as time. When we hear stories of Black men and women dying at the hands of police, it is as much the fault of the individual officers as it is of institutions that enable them. However, this concept of Black Lives Matter is beyond police violence. It's very easy to throw the police under the bus when they are an institution that is so brazen with their violence, dating back to the 1950s, in this country at the very least, and in the US much, much earlier. Black Lives Matter, it goes beyond policing, from Grenfell to Windrush. State racism kills people. The hostile environment policies. The hostile is really, putting it bluntly, in my opinion, acts as a warning really to all immigrants that want to come to the UK, that you're not welcome here, whether you have the documents or not. Looking at the length, the Home Office was going to get rid of immigrants, and for the Windrush, these were people that had been on British soil since they were children. The hostile environment policies were a set of policies introduced in 2012 by then Home Secretary Theresa May. Its aim, make life as difficult as possible for those who cannot show the right paperwork. Or as she said in 2012, the aim is to create a really hostile environment for illegal immigrants. So the government tried to cut undocumented migrants off from essential services like the NHS and make it illegal to work, or for a landlord to rent them a property. Doctors, landlords, police officers, and teachers were obligated to check immigration status, and often people that do not fit stereotypical ideas of Britishness are asked to show their papers to rent a home or access the NHS. In 2012, when the hostile environment was introduced and many of the Windrush generation lacked documentation to prove their right to remain in the UK, this was made worse by the fact that the Home Office had destroyed thousands of landing cards and other records in spite of warnings of the problems this could cause. The Home Office told the Windrush generation they must prove they have lived in the UK since before 1973. The Home Office demanded at least one official document from every year that they had lived here. Attempting to find documents from decades ago created a huge and in many cases impossible burden on people who had done nothing wrong. In 2017, we became witness to the now called Windrush scandal, showing that hundreds of members of Black Caribbeans have been in this country since, in some cases, 1948 up to the late 1960s, were being wrongly detained, deported, and denied their rights. They were used and abused. Massive violations of human rights, and beyond legal discussions, there is a moral question: can human beings be illegal? We see similar discussions now around refugees fleeing war-torn countries. If they're fleeing a country on pain of death, really they should be allowed to stay in any safe country and be helped to find asylum without fear of being sent back. And things like institutional racism, acts of institutions that cannot always be seen or pointed to a single person or thing, institutional inequality, like austerity, poverty, homelessness, how institutions can act violently, in some cases cause death, reminds me of Friedrich Engels and what he was saying in the 19th century. In Victorian Britain, the things Dickens writes about in books like Oliver Twist and Bleak House. And this extends to Black history we are seeing now. Things like the Windrush scandal, which can be really traced to one line in the 1971 Immigration Act that put the onus on the accused, that puts the burden of proof on the accused, not the accuser, to find the proof. Like men like Anthony Bryan, he was detained and really state racism destroyed his life and that of his family. However, he's one of the lucky ones, if lucky is the right term. He was able to recover somewhat, in a manner of speaking, and he's still alive. Other members of that generation are not, killed by the biological weathering that comes with racism, particularly when institutions have the power to uproot one's life, quite literally. The stress that brings. Paulette Wilson and Sarah O'Connor said. So in the words of Engels in response to the Windrush scandal, nearly 200 years after he wrote those words, the deaths of Paulette Wilson and Sarah Connor tragedies, or murder, or social murder. And he says, when one individual inflicts bodily injury upon another, called the deed manslaughter. When the assailant knew in advance that the injury would be fatal, we called his deed murder. When society places hundreds of proletarians, so working class, in such a position that they are inevitably meet too early and a natural death, one which is quite much a death by violence, not by the sword or bullet, when it deprives thousands of the necessaries of life, places them under conditions in which they cannot live, forces them through the strong arm of the law to remain in such conditions until that death ensues, because the inevitable consequence knows that these thousands of victims must perish, and yet permits these conditions to remain. Its deed is murder, just as surely as the deed of a single individual. Disguised, malicious murder against which none can defend himself, which does not seem what it is, because no man sees the murder, because the death of the victim seems a natural one, since the offence is more than one of omission than of commission, but murder it remains. And the Windrush scandal was 70 years in the making, and it started in 1948 with the Nationality Act and the first ship of migrants that came on the Empire Windrush, and then following ships and planes that came up until the late 1960s and early 1970s, including my own grandparents, great-grandparents, my grandaunts and my uncles that came to this country from Jamaica and Grenada as children and young adults. My own family history tied in this language of institutions, and they could have been tied up in this scandal oh so easily. And it was very much avoidable. However, in the language of today, a racial unconscious bias ran rampant through government, a racial thinking that, at least in part, was a trickle down from the colonial racial thinking of Victorian and Georgian times, even Elizabethan, when John Hawkins went on that first slave voyage between 1562 and 1564 under his monarch Elizabeth I. So when you see statements like this, it does not surprise me. These racial stereotypes about Black people have a history. This is quite from a Guardian article by a lady called Gentleman. We learn how ministers in the 50s commissioned researchers to come up with reasons for concluding that non-white immigration was problematic, with senior civil servants instructing dole officers to conduct secret race surveys to see if there was any truth in the assumption that migrants would come to live off the welfare state, and asking police chiefs around the country leading questions like, is it true that they are generally idle? Do they have low standards of living? And are they addicted to drug trafficking and other types of crime? Winston Churchill was obsessed by the considerable number of coloured workers employed by the post office, and by 1955, he was suggesting to ministers that they should fight the next election on the slogan, "Keep Britain White." This is my Uncle Albert. He came to this country in the 1960s and he worked for British Telecom. And this is as much Black history as the slave trade or the Windrush scandal more generally, the most recent Windrush scandal. And you may not learn this at school because it is a history that is in most Caribbean households. How I grew up, I was told stories of Caribbeans in Northamptonshire and London about parties in the front room, and how West Indians brought with them their culture and big smiles and ways of life. They made the West Indies in Northampton and Handsworth and Brixton and Cardiff and across an assortment of towns and cities across the country. I grew up eating dumplings, fried dumplings, rice and peas, curry goat. My grandparents made ackee and saltfish, and then there was the music too. Steel drums, reggae, calypso and soca. When I see photographs of my Uncle Albert, that's what I think of. I think of the stories my mother tells me of how my great-grandmother, Tylee Nowell, and how she would speak in Grenadian French, patois, English, French, hybrid tongues of Grenada. This is the history that is impossible to teach in schools and universities in the framework subjects are currently taught. One of the complaints of West Indian culture is storytelling, and that goes back to slavery with the Amerindian peoples, as well as the Arawaks in the Caribs, and Nani in Jamaica, the Maroons that gave British colonial soldiers hell in setting up their own communities of escaped formerly enslaved Africans and Jamaicans. And the Windrush brought more to the country than contributions to healthcare, railway, and the labour force generally. It completely flipped the British social scene on its head. And their children, Black British Caribbeans born in the 1970s and 1980s that went on to achieve great things. Moreover, not just the children of Caribbeans, but those of African immigrants that went on to achieve in art, science, academia, sports, a lot of which we would call STEM subjects today. In addition, the children and grandchildren of African and Caribbean immigrants in education, fashion, the media, and so much more. And those descendants of immigrants leading the charge now with Black Lives Matter, immigrants whose ancestors survived slavery and the Middle Passage, who survived things like apartheid in South Africa, the Mau Mau uprisings in Kenya, and the activities of Cecil Rhodes in Zimbabwe and Botswana. And then you've got West Indies cricket. When West Indies cricketers came to England and defeated racism on the field of play and completely changed sport that the colonial masters created for the greater good. Moreover, the Black Soldiers is a story that is not also part of the Windrush generation, but also their ancestors that fought in the First World War and the few that fought at Trafalgar as well, not to mention the black and brown soldiers that were part of the Roman army. This story of immigration is the story of Britain, and this is not necessarily a story you can do justice to in the education system, as it is now, where certain forms of knowledge production are valued more highly than others. When we talk about decolonizing the curriculum, how we produce knowledge is also part of that. I asked the question, why is an essay of more social value than oral storytelling, which I know is very common amongst the Windrush generation. This is what we call epistemicide, coming from epistemology, study of knowledge. It's a systematic destruction of any indigenous knowledge base, any knowledge which doesn't converge with the perpetrator's knowledge system. It doesn't believe in fusion or exchange of knowledge, but complete disregard of the other's knowledge and superimposing an alien system at the expense of the other's annihilation. Essentially, it focuses more on, in England, it focuses more on the Eurocentric, and everything else that isn't European is other. This was colonialism at its most violent. One such example being how British colonizers in Jamaica branded Nanny of the Maroons as a witch and her African spiritual traditions as evil to ward off any enslaved that may think of joining her. And going back to the Windrush, this is a history that cannot be taught through conventional means because how we talk about history should not be conventional. Textbooks and sources are useful, but they are also two-dimensional, more so on teaching modern history post-1950s. What about the voices of those that lived it? Like my grandparents, like my parents, like my grand aunties and uncles, and the stories of Black and multiracial Britons that live today. And this goes the same with America with Jim Crow laws. There are still people alive that lived through the Jim Crow era, when there were laws that enforced segregation throughout the American South. One of the most probably more famous now because of Black Lives Matter is Tulsa, where you had white supremacists, where they destroyed a whole town in Oklahoma called Tulsa, often referred to as Black Wall Street. It was a thriving economic powerhouse of business run by Black Americans. Today, you may have heard of initiatives like the Black Pound in light of Black Lives Matter, encouraging people to buy Black and contribute to Black businesses. In 1921, there was a whole town in the US full of Black-owned businesses, and then it was destroyed by racists. What today one would call an act of domestic terrorism. Back then, in the Jim Crow era, that was just business as usual. As before Jim Crow, Black people were enslaved on plantations. Beverly Tatum says, following the Civil War, Blacks were given the right to vote, and some were elected to Southern state governments. Many social reforms, including the establishment of public schools, were instituted in that period. However, there was also massive white resistance from former Confederates, which became violent with the rise of the KKK, the Ku Klux Klan. As Northern law enforcers eventually withdrew from the South, marking the end of Reconstruction, white supremacists reasserted control and took back the South, quote unquote, through the institutions of Jim Crow laws and the disenfranchisement of Black voters. Slavery was replaced with a system of exploitation known as sharecropping, and the use of lynching as a means of social intimidation designed to enforce racial subordination. The thing people have to remember about slavery is how calculated it was. In today's world, it's very easy to criticize slavery after the fact because we seemingly know better. However, human trafficking still happens today, just in different ways. Slavery, as it was back then, was an economic system. The end of slavery after the Civil War left the Southern economy in bits. You now had 4 million people who were property, suddenly now free. There was a gap in the labour market. 4 million people, formerly the most important part of in the South. What do you do with these people? The 13th Amendment loophole was then exploited. The 13th Amendment states that you cannot be a slave unless you are a criminal in jail. first criminalisation of the black race. After the Civil War, they were arrested in mass and essentially made into slaves again. So if you criminalised these new, if you were criminalised, this new freedom didn't apply to you because law stated all criminals were slaves, which then linked blackness with criminality. And the myth that slavery was a task only enacted by white men is a complete falsehood. And despite Black Lives Matter, I found in discussions of slavery, it's still a subject that is blamed or linked with the US. Stephanie E. Jones Rogers states that ownership and control went hand in hand, and for white girls who had slaves, developing techniques of management and discipline was an important aspect of their early training. For those who were newly inducted into slave-owning communities, the plantation was a school where they learned how to be propertied women. So it was an act that both men and women were taught how to do, and Britain did it too. West Trinidadian historian Eric Williams states that slavery in the Caribbean has been too narrowly defined with the Negro. A racial twist has thereby been given to what is basically an economic phenomenon. Slavery was not born out of racism. Racism was the consequence of slavery. Unfree labor in the New World was brown, white, black, and yellow, Catholic, Protestant, and pagan. The first instances of slave trading and slave labor developed in the New World involved racially not the Negro, but the Indian. And this came out in 1944, so forgive the dated terms. By Indian, he means Native American peoples. The Indians rapidly succumbed to the excessive labor demanded of them, the insufficient diet, the white man's diseases, and their inability to adjust themselves to the new way of life. Accustomed to a life of liberty, their constitution and temperament were ill-adapted to the rigors of plantation slavery. So this is basically essentially how slavery began, and only from then it mutated essentially. In British, Ethel Hirsch tells us the hypocrisies of Britain's attitude towards slavery. She writes, "I have always wondered how we have managed to contort our memories in such a way as to celebrate abolishing something, while forgetting how fundamental a prior role we played in developing it in the first place. We were not only one of the trade's major protagonists, but also one of its earliest adopters. From 1562, when Sir John Hawkins began the industrial scale of exploitation of Africans, transporting Britain's first cargo of 500 slaves from West Africa to the Americas. The relationship between the monarchy and slavery was formalized in 1672 with King Charles II's establishment of Britain's first slave trading corporation, the Royal Africa Company. And for those of you who've been following the Black Lives Matter protests, when Edward Colston, being one of the most famous slave traders, was employed by the Royal Africa Company. This company was also the biggest company, the company that made the most profit out of the entire slave trade as well. In Why I'm No Longer Talking to White People About Race, any ideological slavery on history, discussing the role of children and women. We must remember, like Williams says, slavery was economic system. When I was at school, I was not taught how slavery started, but I was very much reminded how Britain ended slavery, as per Ethel Hirsch's statement, and not how there were rebellions on the slave ships, not on the plantations themselves, or from the first abolitionists being enslaved, and also rebellions in Africa at the point of colonization. Edo Lodge says, children born into slavery were the default property of slave owners, and this meant limitless labor at low extra cost. That reproduction was made all the easier by the routine rape of African women slaves by white slave owners. Although people moved to the British colonies, British shores regularly, the plantations they toiled on were not in Britain, but rather in Britain's colonies. The majority were in the Caribbean, so unlike the situation in America, most British people saw the money without blood. Another historian, Peter Fryer, says that nowhere within the British Empire are Black people passive victims. On the contrary, they were active resistors. So even when we learn about slave trade, I did not learn that there were slave rebellions in the Caribbean and in America, nor did I learn about people who were being captured on the African coast, fighting back against European colonial ambition. And now you can see the Black Lives Matter in this country, America, and across the world, Black activists, many of whom will be the descendants of enslaved people, embodying a gift of Black protest against oppression and the establishment. I wasn't taught any of the following at the last point. Much of my life, I've had to do my own reading on this subject and talking to family members about what they know, as they also had to keep themselves. None of this is taught in schools, really. If it is, it's by the will of the teacher because they are interested, but they are not obligated to teach it. What I was taught for the 2 lessons I had when I was 14 was how Wilberforce freed the slaves. So nothing about the rebellions, nothing about the Maroons, just mainly Wilberforce, possibly other abolitionists like Clarkson and Pitt, and possibly a minute on Eluda Equiano, but it was mainly focused on abolition, how Britain freed the slaves after over 2 centuries of being one of the most major protagonists in the slave trade. But nothing about him either. Francis Williams, who I only found out about recently, last year when I was sabbatical officer for Black minority students in Northampton. I invited Dr. John Gilmore from the University of Warwick to speak on Francis Williams at Black History Month. Francis Williams was born in 1700, but he wasn't a slave. He was part of the free population of Jamaica. He was a poet, writer, and scholar, and went to Britain in the 1720s, becoming a naturalized Briton in 1723. He and his wife, Dorothy, were free blacks. His father, John Williams, was a freed slave, and the Williams estate eventually widened to include land and enslaved people. The Williams family were not like many of the blacks in Jamaica, as they were educated in their own land. This is the stuff the child version of me would have loved to learn at school, from the safety of the classroom. However, what many Black people have to do is the extra effort to learn the histories that include people that look like them. And in this history, particularly in the years leading to abolition, we must recount the number of white people in Britain that acted as allies in the abolition movement and slavery. Men like Granville Sharp on the right. To illustrate him, I'm going to read part of a poem that I wrote not so long ago. So, in 1765, a teenage boy was admitted to London St. Giles. His master, beaten badly, left him to wind, rain, and cold, left to die. Sharp found Jonathan Strong, paid his medical bills, and probably saved his life. Sharp could have left him to the cold, sold him for gold, but he didn't. An act of kindness. 2 years later, Strong was abducted and sold to a Jamaican slave trader. Determined to be free, he pled to Sharp for help, not wanting to become part of the next slave ship mutiny, not wanting to become swayed by the seas. This case was not isolated. Blacks were being poached up and down this island nation, carted onto ships and sold back into mass incarceration. Sharp was no lawyer, no legal training. He was just a man, a human being who saw an injustice being committed. He was conscripted the ideals of British freedom. This was about morality and what made Strong's life worth less than his own. This was about how could he hold his head up high in the streets if he left his boy to certain death. He had an unflinching moral compass and saw that what was immoral could not be legal. And in 1772, he won a test case that outlawed slavery in England. So that's Jonathan Strong. That's Granville Sharp on the right. He was a civil servant and he taught himself the law. On the left, you have the Lord Chief Justice Mansfield, who may have been the most powerful man in England in the late 18th century. He was the ruling judge on the infamous Zong trial, where over 100 slaves came together were thrown off the edge of the slave ship Zong. The crew then tried to claim on the insurance, because back then, enslaved Black people were property, not people. And it's bare bones. It was a fraud appeal, a property case. He ruled against slavery. Moreover, Mansfield was the granduncle of 18th century mixed race Briton Dido Elizabeth Bell and Elizabeth Murray. And for those of you that have seen the Amo Sante film, Bell would have been witness to the summary of this slave ship case. Dido was mixed race, the daughter of John Lindsay, Admiral in the Royal Navy, and a slave. But during the 18th century, there were black people and mixed race people in Britain living the lives you and I do today. Some of them had lives of affluence, like Dido, and others were working class, and others lived in poverty. But in this small segment of the slave trade history, I wish I'd learned at school, including the stories of slaves going off the sides of slave ships. It's not a nice history, but it still happened. And in the British obsession with Wilberforce, they've neglected that over 200 years of slave resistance came before 50 years of abolition, but also before Britain abolished slavery. They're one of the main pioneers of it. And in the days that followed abolition in 1833, when the government compensated slave owners some £20 million, 17 billion in today's money, the Victorians continued to profit from slavery. That while Britain had abolished its own slave trading exploits, it still profited from American slavery with the import of cotton. Those of you that are from the north of England may have been taught about spinning jennies and cotton mills of the 19th century. Cotton was picked in the American South by enslaved African Americans and enslaved Africans. When we watch films like 12 Years a Slave and Django Unchained, a lot of that cotton will have gone to England, and the people employed in those mills, many of them were poor, white, working class people. In 1861, the Confederates went to war with the Union for 5 years in what became the American Civil War, which had an impact on the white working classes of the north of England. This was America's aggressive civil war where the future of slavery at the middle. In his documentary, Black and British, Professor David Olusoga states the British government remained officially neutral in the American Civil War. However, many in Britain, rich and poor, did support the slave-owning states, particularly no more than former slave port, Liverpool. This city had made its riches as a slave trading port, and following abolition in 1833, Liverpool had swapped its slave cargo for American cotton. In his documentary, Olusoga states that 85% of the cotton that left New Orleans, Louisiana, flowed up the Mersey River into Liverpool. The Civil War over slavery meant many of those seeking to financially benefit from American slavery were looking at financial ruin when the means of production of cotton was in doubt. Without slavery, they would cease to be rich. Liverpudlian business people ignored their own government's declaration of neutrality to, in all honesty, continued to line their pockets. The pinch of war was taking its toll. Additionally, what I did not learn at school was that northern ships had put a blockade of ships coming out of the south, the southern states. What Olusoga also tells us that ships were built in Liverpool to intercept those ships so they could carry on making money off the cotton picked by enslaved African Americans. And these ships had arms to supply the Confederacy. Not only were they built in Liverpool, but many of its crew members were local people. So without cotton coming into Britain, people lost their jobs as mills shut their doors. In response to the lack of cotton, many of Lancashire's mill towns came out in support of the Confederate states, and by proxy, came out in support of slavery. But one town in particular did not come out in support of slavery. The town of Rochdale in Lancashire is a story of solidarity and protest. People there suffered under what became known as the Lancashire Cotton Panic or the Cotton Famine, but they understood that it is not as bad for them as it was for the enslaved African Americans in America. This was one of the towns first hit by what was happening in the USA, and what was happening in Rochdale was happening across Lancashire and really across the north of England. That happened across the north of England, anywhere that happened to have a cotton mill that employed mill workers. For me, looking at this story of the 19th century is a testament to what particularly white people can do. Looking at anti-racism today, and also people that want to learn more about Black history and how it is useful to them. This is me pointing at the skeptics. I think Black history is not for them. This is history that includes Black people and white people, the poor and the rich, and how there are intersections, a cause and effect that spans a distance of over 4,000 miles. When we read Dickens, this is the sort of poverty the Lancashire famine created. Yet even when they were poor and destitute, thousands of men and women in Rochdale, Lancashire, stood in solidarity with the enslaved in the United States. And I think that is something worth talking about. And yet, there are many stories of Black Victorians in Britain too. That whilst the story of American slavery with Rochdale mill workers is part of British history, there was also Black Victorians in Britain. One such example being Sarah Forbes Bonetta, Queen Victoria's African protege or goddaughter. A number of events involving a one Captain Forbes, his ship Bonetta, and King Gezo of the Dahomey, or Sarah, or Ina, as was her African name, passed into the care of Queen Victoria. First living with Forbes and his wife, Sarah then lived with Victoria and Albert, before marrying a Sierra Leonean called James Davies, and then having a daughter who they named Victoria after the Queen. It's strange to think he would have walked many of the streets Black Britons do today, just over 150 years ago. That brief word on Sarah is a snapshot, but she lived a remarkable life, returning to Africa to raise a family. Watching ITV adaptation of Makepeace Thackeray's Vanity Fair, and then starting the book of the same name, I was introduced to a Bayesian heiress called Rhoda Schwartz. Despite it being a fiction novel, this inspiration for Thackeray to write this character must have come from somewhere. How many Dido Bells have been lost to history? Watching shows like Vanity Fair and Sanditon, based on the unfinished Jane Austen novel, we have to think that the inspiration for these characters comes from somewhere. More stories of Black working class people in Britain at the end of the 19th century include people like Daniel Tull, who made the same journey in 1872 that my grandparents did in the 1960s from the Caribbean. There he is there with his 5 children, including Edward, who would go on to become Glasgow's first mixed-race dentist, and their little Walter, who would go on to be the first mixed-race officer, breaking a colour bar in the British Army, and one of the greatest footballers in the history of football. Britain has had this history of Black sports players going back centuries, including boxing. Cricketers, cyclists, athletes, and that history is also migration. People coming from different places, or in today's language, diversity, and stories outside of the realms of pseudoscience of race we have today, stories of Africans in Tudor Britain. While today we have Black boxing pioneers like Anthony Joshua in men's boxing, the legacy of Black pugilists goes back to the 18th century in Georgian Britain, where men like Bill Richmond would have been enticed by Britain's boxing culture, not before he began his independent life in Britain, serving as an apprentice cabinet maker. It was later in his life he started his rivalry with Tom Cribb. In a sport that made the careers of Black activists such as Muhammad Ali, not only did early pugilists fight without gloves, but practices outlawed in modern boxing, such as shoulder charging, were all regarded as legitimate tactics. Phil Vasili says that Dr. John Ackendorf played for an amateur cricket club in London, as did Dr. James Jackson Brown for the London Hospital. The pioneer professional cricketer was St. Vincent-born Charles Augustus Olivier, who arrived in England with the West Indies cricket team in 1900. According to Geoffrey Green in Black Edwardians, he holds the distinction of being the first African Caribbean West Indies international to play county cricket. Vasili goes on to say, African American racing cyclist Marshall Taylor beat British and continental opponents in 1902. South African boxer Andrew Jephthah won a world title in 1907, and ex-slave Bobby Dobbs fought in Britain in 1898 and returned in 1902. So there's a Black history here that spans generations in education, in sports, and also it's a history that goes back to Tudor Britain as well. John Blank was competent in the court of Henry VII and Henry VIII, and here he was pushing challenging the pay gap. So here he says, "To the king, our sovereign lord, in most humble wise, beseeches your highness, your true and faithful servant John Blank, on one of your trumpets, that whereas his wage now and as yet is not sufficient to maintain and keep him to do your grace like service as other trumpeters do, it may therefore please your highness, in consideration of the true and faithful service which your servant doth unto your grace, and so during his life attendeth to give and grant unto him the same sum / person of trumpet which essentially he's saying that he can't do the same, he can't give the same skills that the other trumpeters do because he's not paid as much as them, and he's asking for a pay increase, addressing a pay gap. And this is from Tudor Britain. So this is before we thought about race as we do today, before the pseudoscience of race. And essentially, I think that's a really interesting thing, because when we do that today, there is so much resistance. And he asked for his pay increase and he got it. So Tudor Britain, we've had black soldiers during the First World War and the Second World War. We've had black activists and anti-racist campaigners during the last century, and now we've got Romans as well. We also know of a unit that included North African soldiers at Hadrian's Wall named Numerus Maurorum Aureliae Norum, after Marcus Aurelius, near to what is today Broughby Sands in Cumbria, where one of the black soldiers in this unit presented a garland of cypress boughs to Emperor Severus. Emperor Severus was also a black man. Archaeological finds dating back to 101 AD to 300 AD, like pottery, North African Roman head pots had also been found in Chester and in Scotland. Furthermore, tombstones and inscriptions. So from the Windrush scandal that we've had recently, and Grenfell and Black Lives Matter, going back nearly 2,000 years to Roman times, where there were black Romans in the north of England and in Scotland, but also down south in places like Eastbourne, which today have been said to be quintessentially white places, but historically speaking, there were black Romans there as well. And even in York, 4th century York, we had Ivory Bangle Lady, and we know she was a black Roman because of the test done on her remains, but also when they found her, she had African ivory on her body too. I'm going to see if I can play a video, and can you put it in the chat if it's working or not? Oh. Um, so here, many of you will recognise the author and activist James Baldwin. Here he's talking about the United States. However, in light of George Floyd, in light of pulling down of Edward Colston, in light of over 20,000 Ofcom complaints against diversity dance performance, the future of Black people in Britain is as dark or as bright as the future of the country. In light of the Macpherson report into the Stephen Lawrence inquiry, the Lamy review into racial disparities into the criminal justice system, the Angelini review into deaths and serious incidents in police custody. In light of the McGregor-Smith inquiry into race at work, the future of Britain is as bright or as dark as some of its most vulnerable. It's not only entirely up to our representatives whether they want to act, but British society more generally. It's not black against white, but really anti-racism versus racism, however that may present itself worldwide. And that includes looking at Black history as a diaspora history. Black people, not only globally, but also in the Black Atlantic as well. Kenneth Perry writes about an address that Baldwin gave. Before concluding his remarks and taking questions from the audience, Baldwin suggests that a key element of working collectively to plot against the master involved unearthing our history. Although he had previously admitted he had little understanding about what it means to be Black in London, he told a mainly Afro-Caribbean audience of Black Londoners, "I'm part of the history that occurred in the Caribbean, and you're part of the history that occurred in Harlem, and one has to accept that and find out how to use that." And I would extend that state of mind to how we think about Black history in the UK. That I don't think we can talk about just Black British history, but Black history as a diasporic history. So it's a global history that hits every continent. British history is history beyond borders, and here today I've given us a very small segment of it, from Grenfell to touching on Afro-Romans, slavery, colonialism, and Black Lives Matter, and Black soldiers. When we talk about Black British history, would it be right to discuss it as an isolated incident when Black British history also includes people who came from the African continent and the Caribbean and America as well? And that's it. So if anyone's got any questions or comments or anything, I think we're going to start Q&A.
Just muted. Thank you very much, Trey, for that. That was really interesting and a really great set of examples to really expand our understanding of Black history, particularly in the UK. So thank you very much for that. I've got one question for you before we check if there are any questions in the side chat. Listening to what you've said today, there's obviously some events of which we ought to be particularly ashamed in the way that Black community have been welcomed in the UK. And I just wonder if you draw any hope at all from the way that the Black Lives Matter demonstrations evolved over the summer, and they seem to have drawn empathy and participation from a wider white audience this time round. And I wonder if that gives you any hope for the prospect of change, or the hope for the prospect of clearer and swifter action in reducing inequalities.
I think there is some hope. I think some institutions have started to look at themselves critically. One of the ones I've seen is the National Trust stuff that's going on with interrogating their histories of colonialism and slavery. So I think that's one thing that would be good to look at in terms of universities and their role in the slave trade and colonialism. So I think there is some hope that's come out of that. The statue coming down was a really powerful moment in terms of activism, because I know the Bristol Public have been campaigning for that statue to come down for years. and this was basically the final straw that they just pulled it down themselves. But yeah, I don't think we should be cynical about the Black Lives Matter movement. But I would also say that change just doesn't happen overnight either. Because I would say, like, when Martin Luther King was marching and company were marching during the 1960s, the civil rights movement did not give birth to great change, because you went from the civil rights movement into then you got Johnson and Nixon, and then you also had Reagan and his war on drugs, which basically completely obliterated Black and Latino communities in America. So I would say it's good, but don't be complacent.
Okay, that's great.
Yeah.
Thank you very much, Trey. I've got a question from Deborah in the chat. So Deborah says, thanks for a really interesting talk. As a geographer, I'm interested in what we should do about public displays of colonial history in our public spaces. What should we do about statues and exhibits in museums? And Deborah says, I think you've partly answered that question, but do you have any other comments?
I think the history of the British, I think colonial history is more than a history subject. Like, colonialism was as much about geography as it was about history, and how it changed the land as well. So I think that's one aspect that you could probably, if you want to decolonize geography, that would be like a really good thing to teach students. Regarding statues, I think Britain could learn a lot from what Germany did after the Second World War, where they took a good portion of their statues off the streets of Berlin and put them into a place called the Spandau Citadel, and basically stripped them of their political power. Statues of Nazis, but also statues of imperial German generals of their colonial past, and put them in a museum where people could look at them outside of their outside of the political context and inside of a historical context that they belong in. So Britain could do a similar thing. And I think that's what I would like to see, probably in a museum of some sort, sort of what's happened with the Edward Colston statue, because I think that's been put in a museum now.
Okay, thanks very much for that, Trey. I think that's an really interesting question, Deborah, and I think it goes back beyond what we do in universities to thinking about how history and geography are taught in schools, and particularly how the dual concerns of both history and geography overlap in teaching in schools. I've certainly seen that in the way that my son has been taught both of those subjects as if they were separate entities and without the informed approach that we've discussed here today. So that's a really helpful question, and one I think for us to grapple with here and to help inform our school partners as well. Tamara's got a question for us. Tamara, you didn't miss this, Tamara, even though you say in the chat, perhaps I missed this because I came in late, but you didn't. Tamara's question is, how can we support Black students in engaging with this hidden history, since it's so important for their liberation and understanding of what is happening in the world around them? So how do we support Black students in engaging with this hidden history? Trey, what are your thoughts?
I think one of the things I've sort of challenged with that is that we only seem to promote the good history. So Walter Tull, I think, will be considered good history because he was part of the army and he was a sports player. And I think if to support Black students properly with that, we need to show that history is not always good, and not all history needs to empower people either. History can just exist as it is, and then what we make of it is what we make of it. And I think to support Black students properly is like to signpost them to the reading as well. If you're at university, I think you should expect students to research and read. They might not always know where to get it, and I think that's when lecturers can sort of take some responsibility of providing reading lists and that sort of thing. So yeah, reading and that course list can include films as well, podcasts, that sort of thing. I know Athol Hirsch has got one on the British Empire, which is on Audible. Yeah, I think supporting Black students is the reading, and there's so many books out now, and they're always coming out. Since Black Lives Matter as well, there's been more of an interest in these sorts of subjects. So I expect that there'll be more coming out in the coming years too.
Yeah, Thanks, Trey. I know that our Library and Learning Services team here curated a reading list along those lines over the summer, and it'd be worth actually me finding that and sharing that in the Q&A at some point. But we do have that reading list that captures some of the excellent writing that's come to the forefront in the last 12, 18 months, 2 years, and also, of course, the excellent podcasts and other media that are available to help us better understand the experience. You and I have spoken, Trey, in the past about George the Poet's work and how excellent that is, and the podcasts that are available on BBC Sounds, as well as Afua Hirsch and others. And Bernadine Evaristo recently has been doing some work on Radio 4, and her Desert Island Discs actually was really excellent a couple of weeks ago in talking through some of the experience that she'd had growing up in the UK. Okay, that's fantastic. Okay, any more questions? Do we have any more questions? No, we don't have any more questions at the moment. So Trey, thank you so much. It's been great to welcome you here to the University of Hertfordshire and to see you again after working with you in the last couple of years at Northampton. And I really hope that we've got a chance to work together again in the future, and that you keep talking and keep challenging everybody in the way that you do so eloquently and well. And it's really great to cross paths with you again. And thank you very much to the SU for facilitating this event for us today, and to everybody that's come along to observe and ask questions, and also to everybody that's watching the YouTube live stream. So hopefully you'll be able to book in to some of our other Black History Month events that are available to book through the University of Hertfordshire website, and hope that you have a great day. And thanks again, Trey, and we'll catch up soon.